This presentation will introduce to the audience my experiences in Denver over the last 7 weeks. They will introduce the methods, my methodologies, and the tools implemented in order to create a functional community action plan. This will be a tool that serves for better living conditions in Denver. Teddy Cruz has been the alternative practitioner that I have focused my research on. His practice is broad as he convenes and uses knowledge from across the fields of architecture, politics, urbanism, visual art, and public culture. On the right-hand side, you can see a diagram depicting a typical architectural scheme where the client serves as the God entity. The architect just falls under the client. Over here, you can see a very linear stream where the brief, design, the consultants, and the product all fall in a line underneath each other. And there's a clear division between the client and architect and the work that he does. On the left-hand side, you can see a diagram in which Teddy Cruz uses in order to run his firm. He uses architectures as an all-inclusive entity where the client brief, urbanism, political theory, urban policy, and public architecture all fall in within the sphere of design. In this type of methodology, architecture is much more inclusive and much more exciting. Teddy Cruz states that we can learn a lot from informality, and in most cases, informality works much more effectively than formality. Teddy Cruz states that density is not just how many buildings can fit onto one lot, but how many social spaces can fit onto one lot. Place of conflict is very important for Teddy Cruz, which I'll get to a little bit later in this presentation. He says that architecture is not just architecture in its own right, but it is social, it is political, it's cultural, and it's economic. It's very important for Teddy Cruz to incorporate collaborative design in his process. Architects are not always the experts. One of the most important theories I used in the Community Action Plan was the theory of crisis by Teddy Cruz. Teddy Cruz states that the world is divided into two spheres: space of conflict and space where there is no conflict, depicted by the red and depicted by the blue. Informal settlements are conflict zones, and thus are zones of opportunity and learning. The non-integrating gap, which is the red, and the functional core, which is the blue, cannot exist without each other. Therefore, they're in symbiosis. And I relate this to Denver, as they are much the same. So one can see in Denver, the theory of conflict is extremely relevant. A lot of the people in Denver rely on the outskirts or the peripheries for work, for economic opportunities. These peripheries also rely on Denver to draw these workers from what is termed the non-integrating gap. Teddy Cruz states that the future of cities today depend less on buildings, but more on the fundamental reorganization of socio-economic relations. He says that the best ideas for renewal will not come from enclaves of economic power and abundance, but from the sectors of conflict and scarcity. Therefore, we need to use our imagination in places of conflict, and this is where architecture will start to push the boundaries. From there, we go on to the different methodologies that are implemented in my design tool or my community action plan. What's very important is small intervention should equal big change. Sometimes something as small as a procedural systematic change within a community makes a huge difference. It's important to be aware that over-eager design and intervention may in fact cause more damage than good. Therefore, sensitivity is extremely important. The way that I went about my methodology is I took the 7-week process that we went through and I broke it down into very systematic parcels. These parcels are week 1, research, week 2, analysis of that research, week 3, engagement, week 4 and 5, which were principles, week 6 and 7 was application and manifestation of that application. And these I'll go into a little bit further in a short while. Looking closer at week 1. Week one was all about site initiation. So before you even take a step on site, it was important to research ethics, to research different cultures that we might experience on site, and also to almost prepare yourself for what was going to happen on site and prepare yourself for communicating with different people from different cultures. As one can see that there's mind maps of different types of ethics. You can see that different mapping techniques just to sort of get yourself used to the spatial conditions on site. I think this is extremely important, especially in terms of pre-engagement. Week two was looking at site analysis and general mapping. This is also extremely important for obvious reasons. One can see a list of mappings over here, and this generally forms more of the quantitative data. These mappings talk of access, an existing electrical network, existing courtyard spaces, and so forth, and so on. Then you go on to the more qualitative data. This was quite important to me, and it's a very similar concept as what Teddy Cruz uses. He uses this method of collage. This type of mapping really sort of connects you to the site in an ephemeral way, and they really are sensory mappings. As you can see on the left-hand side over here, I've tried to connect certain elements of the site, such as tribal, rural, city, and cultural. And this type of mapping really gives you a sense of the tangibility and the ephemeral nature of the site. In the middle, we start mapping thematic lenses such as safety and fear. Over here, this is sort of a sensory mapping of ownership. On the right-hand side, this is trying to understand the differences between the disconnect of the user on the ground and then the experience of myself mapping that. These types of mappings are extremely important, and I think that without them, I wouldn't have arrived to the community action plan you'll later see in the presentation. Going on to week three, we're talking about engagement, which is by far the most important part of this presentation. Engagement plays such a huge role. You can do all the mapping you want, and you can do all the sort of research you want, but actually being on site and what I like to term as drinking tea with the community is where all the richness and all the information that will eventually turn into the data that will cause change. This was extremely important. I mean, you can see on the right-hand side the rich type of conversations that were going on between the students and the community members, and all our rich information came from them. But it was obviously communication was more effective because of the research we did prior to engagement. On the left-hand side, you can see a more top-down approach, which was not as successful as just simply drinking tea with the community. It was a questionnaire that we gave out, and there's a lot of conflicting data in that questionnaire. However, in tandem with each other, I think they worked well. So week four. After meeting with the community and exchanging of principles on a social and cultural and spatial level started to happen. In our case, two principles were discovered. People required a common need and a common resource in order for a public space to be created. On the right-hand side over here, you can see the lengthy process that we went through in order to extract these principles. On the left-hand side, you can see how those principles manifested into a diagram. The principle was a common resource or a common need. This common need was people needed to wash clothes, and the resource was water. These two principles, in tandem with each other, created a social space that worked well in certain instances in Denver. The principles identified in the last slide manifested into the diagram on the right-hand side. This diagram is a map where the darker the color, the more interesting and the more problematic a space was. So by identifying the principles and using it in such a medium like this as a map, it identified spaces where there were problems and spaces that there were possible solutions or lessons that could be learned. Therefore, microsites were then identified. After identifying the principles in week 5. Week 6 was the application of those principles. That would be a need and a resource. The diagram on the right, the need would be to eradicate surface water, especially in rainy season, and the resource would be the trees. So with the tandem of these two elements, one could simply just shape the soil around the trees so that water runoff is directed towards the root systems of these trees, and via transpiration, the trees would be able to expel the excess water on the surface. In being sensitive in such a way, it allows for failure. If this intervention had to fail, it wouldn't be catastrophic in any means or any way to Denver at all. The process that led to my tool is a distillation of the 7-week experience we had in Denver. Logically, the 7 weeks of intense engagement led to multiple tools from multiple groups, multiple individuals, multiple strategies that were developed, therefore creating a method based from this experience in a distilled or crystallized form could provide the beginnings of a system that anyone could use in order to replicate the same results. Therefore, this just becomes a map, or it becomes a methodology in order to replicate our experiences, our 7-week experiences on site. So we started at week 1. At week 7, we had intervention. Whether or not it was successful or not, it depends. It depends on the process. However, the toolkit is that process, and it does allow for failure. Looking at the toolkit in a little bit more detail, the toolkit is divided into 6 steps. Step 1 is the understanding of the site and its community through cultural systems, economic systems, and ethical systems. Step 2 speaks of documenting the physical and spatial conditions on site. This could be access, land use, open ownership, and electrical infrastructure. All these elements play a role in developing a community action plan that might be effective. Looking at steps 3 and 4, which would be drinking of tea and extracting of principles. When I talk about drinking of tea, I'm obviously talking about enhancing relationships, which is by far the most important step in this community action plan. So you enhance your relationships through effective verbal communication, making of friends, and understanding personal scenarios. Step 4 speaks of extraction of principles based on steps 1 through 3. This would be identifying a collective need in our instance. Steps 5 and 6 speak of locating spaces that have the principles identified and implementing them in physical form. Step 5 obviously speaks of locating the spaces where there's a resource and a need. These are the principles that you identified in step 4. Step 6 would be implementing these principles in order to create a product or a solution to the specific problems identified in steps 4. So this brings us to how do we actually use the toolkit in the medium, short, and long term. In the short term, the toolkit should be created by community members over here. By creating these toolkits, it allows for multiple solutions to be generated for multiple problems. In the medium term would be the physical manifestation of the toolkit. After processes 1 to 6, a physical or systematic intervention is developed and becomes a possibility over here. In the long term would be a multiple community action plans or tools developed by multiple community members. These physical interventions can be stitched together in a rhizomatic sense in order to create a functional whole. This process is obviously systemic. So basically what it is, the community action plan, the map or the toolkit, that arises to a physical manifestation. That manifestation in a long-term sense would be many of these community action plans with many of these manifestations that eventually can be stitched or sewn together in a rhizomatic sense to form a functioning whole. Looking at the tool in a little bit more detail, the short term. The community action plan is a tool for the community to identify spatial and non-spatial problems, constraints and solutions. The community action plan helps identify principles that may be used in order to facilitate conversation with stakeholders and promote positive change in the community. As you can see, identification of problems stems right from the community action plan. Identification of opportunities, identification of microsites, identification of common need. Looking closer at the medium term. The medium term is a physical manifestation of the community action plan. In step 6, this is what happens. In my case, it was the trees that were a resource, and the need was the eradication of surface water. So the principles were need and the eradication of the surface water, which manifested into this type of intervention. Obviously, the toolkit will yield different interventions and different principles by the different people or the different community members that use the toolkit or the methodology in order to create systemic change for the community. In the long term, it's about piecing together all the community action plans from all the members. These community action plans will stitch together in a rhizomatic sense because the same system or the same methodology in creating the community action plans are used. These interventions can be stitched together in a holistic sense in order to create a workable whole. So in conclusion, I would like to say that I think the community action plan should be something that is extremely responsible, extremely sensitive. So what we've tried to achieve with this toolkit is to provide the community with a set of instructions or a tool for the community to effect change themselves. They don't need us as the architect to come and effect change for them. And what the tool does, it allows for the community to do that for themselves, which is extremely sustainable in the long term. Therefore, they do not need an external source. What it also does is it allows for better communication between stakeholders. So with the community action plan, there's a set of variables, and with steps 1 through 6, you'll end up with a document or some sort of valuable information that you can go to a stakeholder with, and then you can approach them and say, look, this is what we have, this is what we've identified, this is what manifested, what type of intervention manifested. Might it be physical or systematic? With that type of information, it's much easier to generate conversation. So, yeah, I'll leave it on that note. Thank you for listening.